The wind howled across the dry New Mexico plains, carrying dust and the faint smell of rain that never came. Clara Matthews stood on her porch, one hand gripping the worn railing, her other pressed against her heart as she watched the last of her cattle wander off toward the arroyo. It had been a long, bitter summer. The crops had failed, the well was low, and the banker had stopped calling her Mrs. Matthews with respect. Now he called her Clara, as if her widowhood had stripped her of dignity. Inside the small cabin, her 2 children, Luke, aged 9, and little Sarah, barely 6, sat on the floor with scraps of cornbread and a patched-up doll. Clara forced a smile when she turned toward them. Though her insides felt hollow, they deserved better. Her late husband, Henry, had been a kind man but a dreamer. He'd borrowed to buy more land, hoping to build a future that never came. When his horse threw him one stormy night and broke his neck, all that remained for Clara was debt, 2 hungry mouths, and a ranch no man in town thought she could manage alone. 2 weeks ago, Mr. Harlan, the town banker, had come by in his fine buggy and clean boots. He'd looked around the property with that pitying sort of smile that made Clara's stomach twist. "You've done well for a woman, Clara," he'd said, "but a place like this needs a man's hand. If you can't find someone to help you, I'm afraid the bank will have to foreclose before winter." A man's hand. The words burned her like a brand. That night, when the children were asleep, Clara lit a lamp, pulled a sheet of paper toward her, and began to write with trembling fingers. She didn't write about love, she had no use for it. She wrote about survival. Wanted a husband. Hardworking, sober, and God-fearing. Must be willing to protect a family and work the land. In return, he shall have food, shelter, and a lawful wife. It felt wrong, desperate, but Clara was done being proud. She rode into town the next morning, pinned the notice to the wall of the post office, and tried not to notice the stares of men who thought her foolish. Days passed. Then weeks. No replies came. By the time October winds began to strip the last leaves from the cottonwoods, Clara had nearly given up hope. She worked herself to exhaustion, mending fences, milking the cow, hauling water, and each night prayed for a miracle she didn't believe would come. It came on a pale dawn. She heard the horse first. The steady rhythm of hooves across the hard earth. Luke ran to the door, calling out, "Mama, someone's coming!" Clara stepped outside, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. The man who approached was unlike any she had ever seen. Tall, broad-shouldered, his skin bronze and his hair black as the crow's wing. His clothes were simple, buckskin shirt, worn trousers, and a rifle slung across his back. His eyes were dark and unreadable, yet calm, as if he'd already weighed the world and found his place in it. He dismounted, tied his horse, and looked at her without saying a word for several long moments. Then, in a voice deep and steady, he said, "I came about the notice." Clara swallowed. "The one for a husband?" He nodded once. "My name is Talon. I can work your land. Protect your children. But I need no pay, only food and a roof. You will have my word, my hands, and my name if you'll have me." There was something in the way he said my name as if it carried more weight than she could yet understand. Clara's heart raced. This man was no ranch hand looking for work. There was strength in him and quiet pride. But there was also sadness in his eyes, a loneliness she recognized too well. I don't even know you," she whispered. He inclined his head. "You'll learn if you wish." The wind swept between them, stirring the dust around his boots and the hem of her dress. For a moment they stood, 2 strangers bound by necessity and fate. Then Clara nodded. "All right, Mr. Talon, you'll stay." He bowed his head once in acceptance. And as he followed her toward the cabin, Clara had the strange, unshakable feeling that she hadn't just hired a husband, she'd invited destiny into her home. The church bell rang only once that chilly afternoon, its sound echoing down the empty main street of the small desert town. Clara stood at the front of the church, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. Beside her stood Talon, silent still, his broad shoulders straight as stone. The preacher's voice trembled as he read the vows, his eyes darting nervously between the woman in a plain blue dress and the man with the copper skin and the unreadable eyes. A few townsfolk had come to watch. Curiosity had drawn them more than kindness. They whispered from the back pews, wondering what kind of widow would marry a stranger, and what kind of man would take such an offer. When the preacher reached the words "to have and to hold," Clara's throat tightened. She glanced at Talon. He stood unmoving, his gaze fixed on her, not with desire but with something steadier, almost solemn. When the time came for him to speak, he said, "I do," in a low, even voice that seemed to carry far beyond the church walls. Clara whispered her own "I do," barely more than a breath. And just like that, she was married again. Outside, the sun had slipped low over the horizon. Talon helped her onto the wagon, his touch gentle, though his hands were rough from labor and weather. Luke and Sarah sat in the back, their wide eyes full of questions they dared not ask. As the wagon rumbled down the dusty trail toward home, Clara glanced sideways at her new husband. He said nothing, only scanned the horizon with quiet vigilance, as if even the silence belonged to him. At the cabin, Clara busied herself with supper, cornbread, beans, and the last of the smoked meat. The children whispered in the corner while Talon stood near the doorway, watching without intruding. Finally, when the children were tucked into their bed in the loft, Clara turned to him, uncertain what came next. She had promised herself this would be a practical arrangement, a partnership, not a romance. But now that he was here in her home, the air seemed charged, different. Talon seemed to sense her unease. He stepped closer but stopped a respectful distance away. His voice was low, almost gentle. "I gave my word," he said. "I will protect your home, feed your children, work your land." She swallowed, her heart hammering. "And what about me?" He met her eyes, steady and unflinching. "You are safe with me. I will not touch you unless you ask it." The words startled her, not for their boldness but for their kindness. So many men would have claimed rights over her now that she bore their name. But Talon, he seemed to offer his protection as a choice, not a demand. She nodded slowly. "Then we have an understanding." He inclined his head, his dark hair catching the flicker of the lantern light. An understanding. The wind rattled the shutters, and for a while they stood in silence, the air thick with something unspoken. Clara turned away to bank the fire, but she could feel his gaze linger, steady as a heartbeat. That night she slept in her bed while he lay on a blanket near the hearth. When she awoke near dawn, the fire was low, and she could see his silhouette in the dim light, motionless, awake, watching the flames as if lost in memories that belonged to another life. Over the next days, life on the ranch shifted quietly. Talon rose before sunrise, tending the animals and repairing the fences. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. Luke followed him everywhere, eager to learn how to ride, how to track, how to move quietly in the desert without disturbing a thing. Even little Sarah, shy and cautious, began to smile around him. The neighbors came less often. Some pretended politeness. Others avoided Clara altogether. Whispers grew, about her Indian husband, about whether she'd gone mad from loneliness. Clara ignored them. Each evening she found herself watching him through the kitchen window, how he moved, how he carried himself with that quiet confidence. He belonged to no one, yet commanded respect without a word, and sometimes, when their eyes met across the table, she felt a strange flutter in her chest, something she had buried years ago. Still, she reminded herself, this was an agreement. Safety, not affection. Protection, not love. But one night, when she thanked him softly for fixing the barn roof, he smiled. A small, fleeting thing that transformed his whole face. And for the first time since her husband's death, Clara felt warmth bloom in her heart. And fear right alongside it, because she was beginning to realize that this man she had hired might be capable of breaking through walls she thought would never open again. The first light of dawn had barely brushed the mesas when Clara woke to the sound of hammering. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. Then came the rhythm again, steady, sure, strong. She threw on her shawl and stepped out onto the porch. Talon was already hard at work. The barn door, which had hung crooked for months, now stood propped open as he fitted new hinges. His shirt was off, the early sun bronzing the smooth muscles of his back as he worked. He didn't notice her at first, or pretended not to. He simply drove the nails in with precision, each strike deliberate, the air around him filled with the scent of pine and sweat. "You don't waste daylight," Clara called out softly. Trying to hide her surprise, he turned his head slightly, and for a fleeting second she saw the faintest hint of a smile. "Daylight doesn't wait for us," he said simply. In the days that followed, Talon proved that work was his language. He repaired the corral, dug a new watering trench, and patched the roof before Clara even had time to ask. The children adored him, Luke especially, who followed him like a loyal pup. Talon taught the boy how to tie a proper lasso, how to read tracks in the sand, and how to move silently through the sagebrush. He says if you listen close, the land talks to you, Luke told her one evening, his eyes shining. Clara smiled, but something about the words caught her. She had lived on this land all her life and never once heard it speak. Perhaps that was the difference between surviving here and belonging here. Even little Sarah, shy and frightened of strangers, began to soften. Talon never forced her attention. He simply let her come close when she wanted. Once, Clara found them sitting in the grass outside, Sarah holding out a crumb of bread to a wild rabbit that crept nervously toward her. Talon sat beside her, quiet and patient, his deep voice murmuring something low in Apache. When Clara asked what he'd said, he replied, "I told her the rabbit knows kindness when it feels it." Something in his tone made her chest tighten, but not everyone saw him as she did. When Clara rode into town for supplies, she felt the eyes on her. The whispers followed her like shadows. "That Indian she's got out there," one woman hissed near the mercantile. "You mark my words, he's trouble. Heard he's an outlaw." "Or a deserter," another added. Clara kept her chin high and said nothing. But that night, when Talon came in from the barn with dust on his hands and the faint look of weariness in his eyes, she wondered if he knew what they said. After supper, while the children slept, she offered him coffee by the fire. "They talk about you in town," she said quietly. He didn't look surprised. "They fear what they don't understand," she hesitated. "And should I fear you?" His gaze lifted to hers and the firelight reflected in his dark eyes like embers. "If I meant you harm, you'd know it already." Her breath caught, but there was no threat in his words, only truth. Then, as he set down his cup, she noticed something she hadn't before. On his left wrist, just above the vein, was a mark, an intricate pattern burned into the skin. It looked like a circle of thorns surrounding a bird with spread wings. "What is that?" she asked. He turned his wrist slightly, as if seeing it for the first time in years. "A reminder," he said quietly, "of where I come from, and what I've lost." She wanted to ask more, but something in his expression stopped her. Instead, she said softly, "I'm sorry." Talon's eyes met hers, unreadable. "Don't be," he said. "The past is buried deep. The land covers all things in time." He rose then, nodded goodnight, and stepped out into the darkness. Clara sat long after he left, staring into the dying fire. The shadows danced on the walls, whispering things she didn't yet understand. For the first time, she wondered if the man she'd brought into her home wasn't just a drifter seeking work, but someone running from ghosts that still followed him across the desert. And as the night wind carried the faint cry of a coyote through the valley, Clara realized something else. Talon had brought more than strength to her home. He had brought mystery, and with it, a quiet stirring in her heart that she could neither explain nor ignore. The days had turned colder, the light thinner and sharper. Clara had just come in from hanging the laundry when she saw Talon standing on the rise beyond the corral, his body tense and still as a hawk watching the valley below. "Talon?" she called softly. He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the far horizon. Following his gaze, Clara saw them, a line of riders in the distance, small as shadows against the setting sun. 5, maybe 6 men moving fast and silent. Even from far away, she felt the shift in the air, the sudden unease that rippled through the land. By the time the riders reached the edge of the property, the light had dimmed to copper. They stopped in a half-circle near the barn, their horses breathing mist into the cold air. Clara's children ran to the porch, wide-eyed. "Talon?" Luke whispered. "Who are they?" Talon didn't answer. He stepped forward, his hand resting near the handle of his knife, but not drawing it. One of the riders dismounted, a man with braided hair and eyes dark as polished obsidian. He said something in a language Clara didn't understand, low, rhythmic, almost like the desert wind speaking through the rocks. Talon replied in the same tongue. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. The others watched, unmoving, their expressions unreadable. Finally, the man nodded, glancing toward Clara and the children before swinging back onto his horse. He said one last thing to Talon, something short and sharp. Then the riders turned and disappeared into the growing dusk, vanishing between the low hills without a sound. For a long time, Talon stood where they'd left him. Clara could see the muscles in his back taut as wire, When she approached, she said gently, "Friends of yours?" He shook his head. "Brothers," he said quietly. "They came to see if I had found peace." The way he said it made her shiver. "And have you?" He didn't answer. He simply walked past her and into the barn. That night, Talon didn't come to supper. Clara waited as the children ate and fell asleep, their soft breathing filling the quiet cabin. Finally, she wrapped herself in a shawl and went out to the barn. He was there, sitting by the stall where the lantern light cast long shadows on the walls. His shirt was gone, and she saw with a start a streak of blood running down his arm. "Talon," she gasped. "You're hurt." He looked up, startled, then glanced at his arm as if he hadn't noticed. "It's nothing," he murmured. "A greeting from my brothers." She hurried to fetch a cloth and basin, kneeling beside him. "A greeting?" she said incredulously, dabbing at the wound. He didn't flinch. "Among my people, blood speaks more than words. They wanted to see if I still bled Apache." Her hand froze. "Apache?" she repeated softly. For the first time, he didn't hide from the word. His eyes met hers, steady and unreadable. "You didn't ask who I was when I came here," he said. "And I didn't tell you. It was better that way." Clara's heart pounded. "You think it would have mattered?" "It would have," he said simply. "To others. Maybe to you." She shook her head, pressing the cloth tighter to stop the bleeding. "You've done nothing but work yourself half to death for us. You've kept my children safe. I don't care what blood runs in your veins." Something softened in his gaze then, something she hadn't seen before. He reached up, his rough hand brushing hers briefly, a touch that sent a shiver down her arm. "You have courage," he murmured. "More than most." She looked at him, really looked. The calm, the strength, the sorrow that never seemed to leave his eyes. She realized this man had carried pain long before he ever came to her doorstep. "Talon," she whispered, "what are you running from?" He turned away, his jaw tight. "The past," he said finally, "and the dead who still walk with me." For a moment, silence filled the barn, the kind that feels alive, breathing between two hearts. Then he rose and walked to the door, his shadow stretching long behind him. "Go inside, Clara," he said softly. "Lock the door. There may be others who come before long." She hesitated, fear curling in her stomach. "Others?" He looked out into the night toward the dark line of the hills. "The desert never forgets its chief," he said. And as the wind stirred through the mesquite, Clara understood that her husband, her quiet, mysterious Talon, was not just a man with a past. He was a leader once, a chief, and the past he had tried to leave behind was riding toward them again, one shadow at a time. The morning after the riders came, Talon was gone. Clara woke before dawn, the fire cold, his blanket untouched. At first she thought he might be in the barn, but his horse was missing too. The sight made her chest tighten with a strange ache she didn't want to name. Luke found her standing by the fence, staring toward the horizon. "Mama," he said softly, "is he coming back?" She forced a smile she didn't feel. "He said he would protect us. He'll come back." But as the hours passed, the silence of the desert grew heavier. By the second day, worry had gnawed its way past reason. She saddled her old mare before sunrise and left the children with the neighbor, Mrs. Turner, who gave her that look, the one halfway between pity and disbelief. "You're riding after an Apache?" the older woman asked. "You're mad, Clara Matthews." Clara tightened the reins. "Maybe," she said quietly. "But he's my husband." The trail was long and harsh. Talon's tracks led south into the red canyons where the land turned wild and broken. The air shimmered with heat by noon, and her throat burned with thirst, but she pressed on. She had never ridden this far alone, yet something, instinct, maybe love, kept her going. As the sun began to sink, she spotted smoke curling from a ravine. She dismounted, crept forward, and peered down. What she saw stole her breath. A hidden village lay nestled between the cliffs, small lodges built of hides and brush, fires burning low, children running among them. Men with dark hair and proud faces moved quietly through the camp, and women ground maize or tended fires. But at the center of it all stood Talon. He was dressed differently now, buckskin and beads, a carved necklace of bone and turquoise hanging against his chest. The people around him bowed their heads as he passed. He wasn't just one of them. He was the one. She watched in awe as he stopped before an old man seated by the fire. The elder spoke, gesturing toward the sky, his words low and solemn. Talon listened, his face grave. When the old man finished, Talon placed a hand over his heart and nodded. The firelight caught on the markings burned into his wrist, the same she'd seen before. But now she saw others on his arms, faint scars forming patterns of feathers and flame, symbols of leadership, of blood and oath. A woman beside Clara gasped quietly. Startled, Clara turned and found herself face to face with an Apache woman perhaps near her own age. Her dark eyes were curious but not hostile. "You should not be here," the woman said softly in broken English. I had to see him," Clara whispered. "He's my husband." The woman tilted her head, studying her. "Yes," she said at last. "He told us of the white woman, the one who gives him peace." Clara's pulse quickened. "He told you that?" The woman smiled faintly. "Our chief carries many ghosts. We prayed he would find rest. Perhaps he found it with you, Chief?" Clara repeated, stunned. The woman nodded toward Talon. "He is Talonte, last son of the Eagle clan, our leader. He left after the soldiers came, after the killing." Her gaze fell to the ground. "He lost much that day, wife, son, tribe scattered like dust. Only now they come back to him." Clara's throat ached. The man who had quietly mended her fences, who tucked her daughter in at night and smiled so rarely, it all made sense now. His silence, his sadness, the loneliness behind his eyes. The woman looked at her again. "He does not know you are here." "You should go before the men see. They will not understand." But Clara shook her head. "No, I need to speak to him." When she stepped into the open, all eyes turned toward her. Talon's head snapped up, disbelief flashing in his face. He moved toward her at once, his expression unreadable. "Clara," he said, his voice low, taut. "You shouldn't have come." "You left without a word," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I had to know who you really are." For a moment, silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the murmurs of his people. Then Talon exhaled slowly, shoulders sinking. "I am who I was born to be," he said quietly, "and I am who you made me remember." He took her hand, gently, reverently, and led her away from the watching eyes, deeper into the canyons where the wind carried whispers of old pain and new beginnings. And as they walked, Clara realized she hadn't come to find a missing husband. She had come to uncover the truth, and the truth was more powerful, more human, and more heartbreaking than she had ever imagined. The night air in the canyon was sharp and cool, carrying the faint scent of juniper and smoke. Talon led Clara along a narrow path until the campfires faded behind them. The moonlight spilled silver across the red cliffs, painting his face with shadow and light. He stopped beside a stream that wound through the rocks, its surface reflecting the stars like scattered glass. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Clara whispered, "You could have told me." He stood with his back to her, his voice low. "I wanted to." "Then why didn't you?" He turned slowly. The calm she always saw in him was gone now. His eyes burned with something deeper, older. "Because your world and mine were never meant to meet, Clara. I came to you with nothing but my hands. I did not want your fear or your pity." Her throat tightened. "You think I pity you?" He looked at her, unflinching. "You should. My people were hunted, driven from the lands of our fathers. I led them once, led them into battle. Too many died because of me." Clara took a step closer, her heart hammering. "You fought to protect them." "I fought," he said, his voice hard, "and lost everything." He sank to one knee by the stream, scooping up a handful of water and letting it slip through his fingers. "The soldiers came at dawn. My wife, my little boy. They were still inside our lodge. I tried to reach them." His voice broke just slightly, but he continued. "When the fire took the roof, I thought I would die with them. But my warriors pulled me away. I lived when I should have burned." Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, tears blurring her sight. She had known he carried sorrow, but not the kind that hollowed out a man's soul. "I buried them myself," he went on, staring at the stream. "Then I buried my name. I left my people and swore never to fight again. I wandered, worked for strangers, lived by no law but the wind. I thought peace meant forgetting. But peace is not forgetting, it is remembering without pain. And I never learned how." Clara knelt beside him, her hand trembling as she reached for his arm. "Talon," she whispered, "you've carried this alone for too long." He looked at her then, and the hardness in his face softened. "You should not have followed me," he murmured. Maybe not, she said. But I'm here, and I'm not leaving. The silence between them stretched, filled with the soft murmur of water and the distant cry of an owl. Talon's shoulders eased. He reached for her hand, his touch uncertain at first, like a man afraid to hold something fragile. Why do you not fear me? He asked quietly. Clara gave a faint, trembling smile. Because you've never given me reason to. For the first time since she'd met him, Talon's expression broke, not into anger or grief, but into something raw and real. His hand tightened around hers, his thumb brushing her wrist as if trying to memorize her pulse. I thought I was done with love, he said softly. It took everything from me once. She met his gaze. It gave you everything, too. You loved deeply once, Talon. That's not something to regret. He shook his head, but the resistance in him was fading. And you, Clara Matthews, you lost, too. She nodded, eyes glistening. Yes, I thought when Henry died I'd buried my heart with him. But then you came. You didn't ask for anything. Didn't expect gratitude or affection. You just stayed. And somehow, that meant more than love ever did before. Talon's breath caught, his fingers still entwined with hers. You make it sound so simple. Maybe it is, she whispered. Maybe peace isn't found in forgetting who we were, but in forgiving ourselves for surviving. He stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly he leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers. The touch was tender, reverent, a vow unspoken. When he finally pulled back, his voice was rough but steady. If I stay, the world you know will turn against you. She gave a faint, fearless smile. Then let it. For the first time, Talon smiled too, soft and sad, but true. You have the spirit of the mountain hawk, he said. Brave and foolish. And you, she replied, her voice breaking slightly, have the heart of a man who's forgotten how to rest. He brushed his thumb against her cheek, wiping away a tear. Then teach me. Under the vast desert sky, surrounded by the whispers of the canyon, the woman who had once hired a husband and the warrior who had once buried his name found something neither had expected: truth, forgiveness, and the fragile beginnings of love. The sun rose like a blade of fire over the hills, slicing through the mist that clung to the plains. Clara had barely slept. The memory of Talon's confession, his voice rough with grief, his hands trembling against hers, still echoed in her chest. But when she stepped outside that morning, the sound of hoofbeats shattered the fragile calm. A line of riders appeared on the horizon, men in dust-covered coats, their rifles glinting under the rising sun. At the front rode Sheriff Tom Barlow. Clara's stomach sank. Talon emerged from the barn, shirt sleeves rolled, the morning light catching in his dark hair. His hand rested casually on the doorframe, but his eyes had already taken in the scene. The armed men, the set of their jaws, the sheriff's cold expression. Clara Matthews. The sheriff barked as he rode up. You mind telling me what business you've got harboring a wanted man? Clara's throat tightened. Sheriff, I think you're mistaken. Mistaken? Barlow swung off his horse, dust swirling around his boots. You know who this is, don't you? That's no ranch hand. That's Talon Blackbird, Apache war chief, wanted for the killings at Fort Mason. Talon's face remained unreadable, but his eyes turned dark as a storm. You've been fed lies, Sheriff. Barlow's hand hovered near his gun. Maybe, but lies don't come with bounty posters. He nodded toward one of his men, who pulled a crumpled sheet from his saddlebag and held it up. The sketch was rough but unmistakable. Talon's sharp features, his braids, that proud, watchful gaze. Clara stepped between them before she could think better of it. He hasn't hurt anyone, she said firmly. He's been working here, helping me. You can ask anyone in town. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. Helping you? You mean living under your roof, taking your money, pretending to be something he ain't? How long you think you can keep him safe once the army gets word he's here? Talon's jaw tightened. If they come, they'll find no fight from me. Barlow let out a short, humorless laugh. You think that matters? They don't care if you're done fighting. To them, you're still the enemy. He turned to Clara, his voice lowering. You'd do well to stay out of this, Mrs. Matthews. You've got a child to think about. Clara's voice trembled, but her eyes didn't flinch. My child adores him. He's done more for us in 3 months than anyone since my husband died. Barlow frowned, a flicker of pity passing through his expression. You always had a good heart, Clara. But this ain't kindness, it's suicide. If you won't turn him in, I'll have to do it myself. He motioned to his deputies. Before they could move, Talon stepped forward. If your quarrel is with me, Sheriff, then leave her out of it. I'll go. Clara spun toward him. No. His eyes met hers, calm, resolute. It is better this way. They will not harm you if I surrender. Barlow snorted. You're not in any position to make demands, Chief. But before he could reach for his cuffs, Clara's voice rang out. You'll have to go through me first. The men hesitated, uncertain, their gazes flicking between the trembling widow and the silent warrior. The sheriff's jaw clenched. Clara, you think you're protecting the law, she said, stepping closer, her voice shaking but clear. But this man saved my life. He saved my son's life. And if you take him now, you're no better than the ones who burned his people alive. A murmur rippled through the deputies. Even the sheriff faltered for a breath. Talon looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his chest cracked open. He had spent years walking as a ghost, but in that moment, watching her stand trembling and defiant in front of him, he felt alive again. Barlow sighed and removed his hat. You've got until sundown, he said finally. If he's still here by then, I'll be back with soldiers. He swung into his saddle and motioned to his men. The horses thundered off, leaving a trail of dust in the air. Clara turned to Talon, her voice raw. You're not leaving, Clara. No, she said fiercely. You've spent your life running. Maybe it's time to stop. He looked down at her, at the fire in her eyes, and something like peace flickered across his face. Then if I stay, he said softly, I stay as myself. Not as your hired husband, but as the man who would give his life to protect you. Clara's breath caught, and she nodded slowly. Then we'll face whatever comes. Together. The wind swept through the valley, stirring the dust where the sheriff's horses had passed. The sun climbed higher, and for the first time since he buried his past, Talon stood unhidden in the light. The wind howled across the plains that night, dragging the scent of rain and dust through the ranch. Clara moved through the small cabin in silence, bolting windows, checking the lanterns, glancing again and again toward the door as if it might burst open at any moment. Talon stood by the hearth, sharpening his knife in slow, rhythmic strokes. He hadn't said much since the sheriff left, but Clara could feel the war raging inside him. The calm in his eyes was only the surface. Beneath it, the current ran deep, dark, and dangerous. Outside, thunder cracked across the sky. You don't have to stay, she said finally, setting down the lamp. You can still ride before dawn. No one would blame you. He didn't look up. You would. Her throat tightened. Yes. He sheathed the blade and turned toward her, the firelight casting gold across his face. Then I will stay. Clara stepped closer. They'll come for you, Talon. The sheriff, the soldiers. They won't stop. He nodded once. I know. Then why? She whispered, his gaze softened. Because running means leaving you and the boy. And I've done enough leaving. A sharp knock sounded at the door. Clara froze, her heart leaping. But before either of them could move, a small voice called, Mama? It was Eli. Clara exhaled in relief and hurried to open the door. Her son stood barefoot on the porch, clutching his worn blanket. Mama, I can't sleep. The thunder's too loud. She knelt, brushing the hair from his eyes. Come inside, sweetheart. Talon crouched beside them. A storm only sounds fierce because it speaks with the voice of the mountains, he said gently. But even mountains rest when the sun rises. Eli's eyes widened in awe. You really think so? I know so, Talon said, touching the boy's shoulder lightly. Now go back to bed. The thunder won't hurt you. Eli nodded, yawning. Will you still be here when I wake up? Talon hesitated, glancing at Clara. Yes, he said finally. I will. When the boy disappeared into his room, Clara turned toward him, eyes bright with emotion. You shouldn't promise him that, she said softly. I never make a promise I will not keep, Talon replied. Outside, the storm broke, rain lashing against the windows, lightning flaring across the sky. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. Talon walked to the window, scanning the dark hills. They will not wait until morning, he murmured. Barlow will come before dawn. Clara's hands trembled. Then we'll hide you, he shook his head. No, I will not have soldiers tear apart your home. But if you surrender, they'll kill you. He turned to her, his voice calm. Not if I make them see who I am. She stared at him, tears gathering. You think they care who you are? They see an Apache. That's all. Talon stepped closer, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. Then I will make them see what an Apache protects. Her breath caught at the quiet strength in his words. He looked down at her, his hand lingering against her face. When they come, take Eli to the barn. Wait for the shooting to stop. No matter what you hear, do not run to me. I can't just stand by. You can, he said gently. Because I need you to live, Clara. The rain hammered harder. A wild drumming that drowned out everything else. Then through the roar came another sound, faint at first, then unmistakable. Hoofbeats. Clara's breath hitched. They're early. Talon moved to the door, his knife glinting in his hand. He looked back once. Remember what I said. She caught his arm. Talon, if you die out there. He stopped her with a quiet look, eyes burning like embers. Then know this. You were the only peace I ever found. Before she could speak, he stepped into the rain. The storm swallowed him whole. Clara pressed a hand to her heart, listening to the thunder merge with the distant shouts of men and the crack of gunfire. The world outside had become chaos, lightning flashing over silhouettes on horseback, the clash of men in storm and fury. In the barn, Eli stirred, whispering for his mother. Clara forced herself to move, to run to him, even as her body screamed to turn back toward the door. The wind roared like a wounded beast, and somewhere in the darkness she thought she heard Talon's voice, low, fierce, defiant, answering the night itself. Dawn came slow and gray, dragging the storm's silence behind it. The land was soaked, the air heavy with smoke and the acrid scent of gunpowder. The hills still echoed faintly with what had passed in the night. Clara stepped out of the barn, clutching Eli to her side. Her bare feet sank into the wet earth as she scanned the horizon. The corral fence was splintered, one of the wagons overturned. A trail of hoofprints led toward the road, and in the mud near the porch a single feather lay glistening. She bent and picked it up, black and white, streaked with blood. Her knees nearly buckled. "Ma," Eli whispered. She swallowed hard and forced a trembling smile. "Stay here, sweetheart." She moved toward the porch, heart pounding. Then she saw him. Talon was on his knees in the mud, wrists bound in iron cuffs. His hair hung loose, soaked and tangled, his shirt torn at the shoulder. 2 soldiers flanked him, rifles at the ready. Sheriff Barlow stood nearby, hat low against the drizzle, his expression grim. "Clara," he said softly, "stay back." She ignored him, hurrying forward until one of the soldiers raised his weapon. "Don't you dare point that at me!" she shouted. Barlow lifted a hand. "Easy, boys," he turned to her. "It's over. He surrendered before any of you were hurt. Saved my deputy's life, too." Clara's eyes flew to Talon. "You surrendered?" He looked up at her, his gaze steady despite the bruises on his face. "You and the boy are safe. That is all that matters," her breath caught. "You think that's enough?" One of the soldiers sneered. "Ma'am, this man's a murderer. You should be thanking us." Clara spun on him, fury shaking through her. "Murderer? He's a husband, a father, a man who's done nothing but protect this land. You know nothing of him." Barlow sighed, running a hand over his stubbled chin. "Clara, the army's been after him for years. Orders are orders. I don't care about your orders," she cried. "He's innocent." Talon spoke then, voice low. "Clara, enough." She turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "No, I won't let them take you." He looked at her the way a man looks at sunlight, aching to hold it, knowing he can't. "You must." Barlow hesitated. "He's to be taken to Fort Mason. They'll decide his fate there." Maybe they'll show mercy." "Mercy?" Clara whispered. "They'll hang him." The sheriff didn't answer. Talon rose to his feet as the soldiers tightened his chains. He winced but didn't resist. "Let them do what they must," he said quietly. "But hear me, Clara Matthews, don't run after me. Don't follow. The boy needs you more than I do." She stepped closer, ignoring the soldiers' protests, and pressed her trembling hands to his face. "Don't you dare speak as if you're already gone," she whispered. "You gave up your name, your past, your home, but I won't let them take your life too." His eyes softened. "You are stronger than you believe," her voice broke. "Not without you." He leaned forward until their foreheads touched, chains clinking softly between them. "Then remember this," he murmured. "The storm passes, always." Barlow cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "We've got to move out." Clara turned on him. "If you take him, I'm coming too." "Clara, you'll have to drag me away if you don't." The sheriff hesitated, then finally nodded. "Fine. You can follow as far as the river crossing. After that, it's army land." Talon met her gaze one last time, something fierce and unspoken passing between them. Then the soldiers mounted their horses, pulling him up with them. Clara watched as they rode off through the drenched valley. The man she'd hired as a husband, who had become her protector, her heart, her everything. Eli ran to her, clutching her skirt. "Mama, where's he going?" She knelt and gathered him close, her tears falling into his hair. "Somewhere he shouldn't have to go," she whispered. "But we're going to bring him home." The wind stirred again, lifting the wet feathers scattered in the mud. Clara rose, determination blazing through her grief. The storm had not broken her. It had only shown her what she was capable of. She turned toward the house, toward the horse waiting in the corral, and toward the rising sun. This time, she would not let him face his fate alone. The road to Fort Mason stretched long and merciless beneath the Texas sun. Dust rose in thick clouds behind the riders as Clara pushed her weary horse onward. For 2 days she had followed the soldiers' trail, through swollen creeks, over red mesas, and across the open plain that shimmered like a sea of fire. Eli rode behind her on the saddle, his small arms wrapped tightly around her waist. "Mama," he whispered once, voice trembling. "Will they hurt him?" Clara's throat tightened. "Not if I can help it, sweetheart." By the time they reached the fort, the sun was sinking low, turning the sky to molten gold. The wooden gates loomed tall, guarded by soldiers in blue uniforms. Beyond them, the clang of hammers and the bark of orders filled the air. Clara dismounted, lifting Eli to the ground. Her legs shook, but she stood straight as a captain's wife. "I'm here to see the prisoner they brought from Clearwater," she told the guard. The soldier frowned. "You mean the Apache?" Her jaw clenched. "His name is Talon." The guard hesitated, then finally nodded. "You got 5 minutes." He led her through a narrow courtyard to a small cell near the back of the fort. Inside, Talon sat on the floor, hands still bound, back straight despite the bruises across his shoulders. When he lifted his head and saw her, a flicker of disbelief crossed his face. "You shouldn't have come," he said quietly. "I told you," she whispered, stepping closer to the bars. "I'm not letting you face this alone." He rose, the chains clinking. "If they see you here, it will only bring trouble." "Then let it." Her hands wrapped around the cold iron. "You once said peace isn't forgetting. It's forgiving yourself for surviving. Maybe now it's time you forgive yourself enough to fight for your life." Talon's expression softened. "And if I cannot win?" "Then we fight anyway," she said fiercely. Before he could answer, the heavy door creaked open. Sheriff Barlow entered, hat in hand. His eyes softened when he saw her. "Clara, you shouldn't be here." "I could say the same to you," she said sharply. "You know he's no murderer." The sheriff sighed. "Doesn't matter what I know. The army wants blood for Fort Mason. They'll hang him at dawn." Something inside Clara went cold. "Then you'd better listen to me now, Tom Barlow, because I'm not letting that happen." Barlow frowned. "Clara, I have witnesses," she cut in. "Your deputy, the storekeeper, half the town. They all saw what he did. He saved people. He saved you. And if you hang him, that truth dies with him." The sheriff hesitated. "The colonel won't care for words." "Then give him proof," Clara said. She turned to Talon, eyes blazing. "Tell them what happened that night at Fort Mason. Tell them who really gave the order." Talon's jaw tensed. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he spoke, his voice deep and steady. "It was Colonel Hayes. He ordered the raid on my village. When we fought back, he blamed us for his mistake. His men burned our homes. My family died because of him." Barlow's eyes widened slightly. "You can prove that?" Talon nodded toward his wrist. "Under this band there is a scar, his mark. I wore his irons once. He branded me a savage. Let him look upon his work before he judges me." The sheriff swallowed hard. "Wait here." He turned and strode out. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Outside, the campfires flickered to life, and the sound of soldiers' laughter drifted faintly through the walls. Clara's heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. Then the door opened again. Colonel Hayes entered. He was older than Talon remembered, gray in the beard, eyes cold and calculating. "You," he said. "I thought you died in the canyon." Talon lifted his chin. "You burned my people. You called it justice," the colonel sneered. "It was war." Clara stepped forward. "No, it was murder." Hayes' glare cut to her. "Who are you to speak here, woman?" "I'm the one whose husband you're about to hang," she said evenly. "And I'll speak until you hear the truth." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Barlow entered behind the colonel, a folded paper in hand. "Colonel," he said, voice low, "I've written an affidavit." The prisoner surrendered peacefully. "Saved my deputy's life, and I've confirmed reports from survivors. The raid was under your command." The colonel stiffened. "You overstep your authority, Sheriff." Barlow met his gaze. "Maybe, but I've also got a dozen witnesses ready to swear the same." A long silence followed. Then Hayes turned to Talon, his face pale with fury. "You should have stayed in the ground with the rest of them." Talon held his gaze, calm and unbroken. "And you should have stayed a man, not a coward hiding behind orders." The colonel spun on his heel and stormed out. Barlow exhaled slowly. "He's done. They'll release you by morning." Clara's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling freely now. She turned toward Talon, laughter and sobs mingling. He stepped close to the bars, voice low and rough. "You came for me." She smiled through her tears. "You once carried me when I couldn't walk." "I only returned the favor." Barlow unlocked the cell. The door swung open with a rusty groan. Talon stepped out, free at last. Outside, dawn broke over the plains once more, the same light that had watched him lose everything now shining on his redemption. He turned to Clara, cupping her face gently. "What happens now?" She smiled. "We go home." He looked out across the horizon, then back at her. "No," he said softly. "We make one." As the rising sun bathed them in gold, the Apache chief and the woman who had once hired a husband walked out of the fort hand in hand. No longer captor and captive, widow and hired man, but equals, survivors.